A destroyed sanctuary bathed in corpses had a single person glowing at its center. He used some kind of magic on the ground asking for a response. If there were any survivors, they should answer, and if they couldn't speak, they should move or make some sound. He pleaded as he emanated his magical power, thinking that in the end no one was left and he was the last survivor. But there was someone reflected in his pupil, saying that the one who had consolidated the demons for the first time, leading humans to complete collapse. His name was High Priest. The white-haired man repeated some words in an ancient language, saving a baby from a demon's hand, taking it far away from those creatures. In the war against the demons who came from their demonic plane, the mages from the White Magic Tower followed him, putting everything on the line for the future of humanity. If not for them, no one could have done what they did. A humanoid female figure appeared in that bloody sanctuary scene, and stated that on April 28th, at 3:12 p.m., she confirmed that the high priest no longer breathed. The mage called that woman Edna, being the final dragon and observer who records history. Edna Sol Laplace she called the master of the White Magic Tower, saying she had good and bad news, and the mage told her to start with the bad news. Edna explained that the demon army invaded the White Tower, and in the process most of the mages lost their lives, and the tower was destroyed with mages and research incinerated. The tower master asked about the good news, and she said that the Imperial forces arrived earlier than expected, and would rescue the survivors and his disciples. Coughing, the man said it was a relief. Edna wanted to know if he regretted today's lesson. He denied it, saying that because of the person he chose and brought to himself, he could not regret that decision in front of them. Edna asked if he had anything to say. The man asked her to look after his disciples from time to time, as they were young and eager. Edna said she would look after them occasionally. He ironically commented on a dragon bowing to a mere human. The dragon explained that he was right to notice it for the continent, and she herself would not forget the sacrifices made by the White Magic Tower. The man said it was obvious if that was the case, reflecting that it would be a lie to say he had no regrets, for he was the best mage but a poor leader. But if by chance he were given another opportunity, even if called a villain, he would want to live selfishly just for himself, thinking of caring for his disciples. The man wanted to live that kind of life. Edna closed the eyes of the master of the White Magic Tower, saying that at 3:47 p.m., she confirmed that the master of the White Magic Tower, Oscar Sage, was no longer among the living. The high priest had taken the lives of hundreds of mages in action, including the level 9 mage Oscar Sage, who lost his life in the process. A light breeze ran through an immense tower. A black-haired man lay on a bed, and a white-haired one looked at him. A leaf touched the hand of the man. He suddenly rose in shock, while the blue-haired one was struck by his hand and spilled the water, saying he was soaked and had just been changing his towel, because those sleepwalking habits of his were annoying, and he never showed gratitude for being cared for. And the man repeated that, saying he had fallen asleep and in his near-death state. More importantly, he thought he would lose his life, saying he was sure the high priest had pierced his heart. Then he tried to explain what was happening, but was interrupted. An enraged blond man said he was awake. The blue-haired boy told the elder to calm down, because he had only been awake for 5 minutes. But the elder told Frank to move, because he would make sure to make him pay. Oscar Sage asked how he was alive. The elder repeated that in anger and said he must find it fascinating to be alive, while Oscar noticed he must be a mage from the White Tower, then ordered him to explain the current situation in detail, and the elder repeated that, angry for having to explain. He stepped forward to slap him, saying he should reflect and beg. Oscar asked about the attack, and if it was an assassin planted by the demons, using the windshield that would instantly block any attack, and the wrist that faced the wind would become like straw. He was a low level who hadn't thought before attacking, wondering why the windshield was vanishing, and what kind of pathetic magical power that was. The elder moves his hand, saying the shield was good, and he hadn't just been fooling around all this time. He was going to propose disciplinary actions regarding the research activities, and should now focus on recovering. And Frank tells him to go on his way. He questions whether Oscar had gone insane, while the boy trembles, thinking the shield disappeared the moment he used it, and wonders how long he had been asleep. Frank comments that Elder Maxim had that kind of personality, and that he was screwed, while Oscar reflects that his mana circles, quantity and purity were all bad. He wants to know what was wrong with his body and asks what day it is. So Frank replies that it's September 21st and he had been unconscious. Oscar wants to know if he had been asleep for 5 months, and Frank asks what he's talking about since only a single day had passed. Oscar says that either way they should call Lloyd, and if he's not there, then Gilly or Sasha, and find out exactly what happened. Frank tells him to forget those traitors, and wants to know why he's saying the name of the Tower Master, so informally wondering if it's a side effect of forgetting, because Lloyd Schultz abandoned the White Tower and became a disciple of the Red Tower Master, and Juliet Dominic stole and fled with a high-level book. Oscar notices that the air around Frank wasn't moving. Then he repeats about Sasha being the Tower Master, and wonders how a 5-year-old managed that friend, wonders why he's leaving out the 20 that came before that. The mage thinks some people have amazing imaginations, and wonders why he's getting angry at a kid, but that was completely natural. Seeing a strange reflection in the window, Oscar wonders who that person in the mirror is saying. He can't believe it after seeing that, because 20 years had passed since he lost his life, and so much had developed. Now there were things lighting up the streets, and even cars driving around. All that was thanks to the revolution of magical engineering. He thinks they must have loved seeing this, because even with the world collapsing, they just gave up on everything and organizing. All the information he learned about the owner of this body. Oscar Crushing was taken by the Magic Tower when he was 10, and is now 20, being a level 1 mage from a fallen noble family. But he's a terrible mage for being level 1 at 20 years old. As a result, he tried to accelerate his progress by buying an illegal elixir, and after drinking it he collapsed. It all made sense, because if it had worked, it would have multiplied his mana several times, and on top of that, his life would be in danger for being illegal, having died from an overload. But he notices something different in his body, wanting to know what that was, because he had too much mana for a level 1 mage, and it was the purest kind, still unrefined. Wondering if it was obtained through that illegal elixir. But a drop of blood comes out dripping from his finger. Oscar asks what that is. Impurities come out from his fingertip, falling to the ground and dissolving immediately. Oscar is surprised to see that, wondering if it was some kind of poison and why that was in his body. But he says he understands it now, because he had a hunch about this situation first. His illegal elixir wasn't the culprit, because a proper elixir would be impossible to buy, even for a high price. Problem was that Oscar didn't know there was poison in there, after thinking about how much liquid had come out. In other words, he didn't lose his life from overload, but from poison, and that level of poison was way too high to have taken the life of a level 1 mage. And if it hadn't been him, it would have been hard to trace it. Clenching his own fist, Oscar stands up and says he doesn't know who was playing with his soul, but as a result, he had a second chance after thinking about this before, losing his life, selfish life for himself, and that wasn't a bad start for it. Saying that as payment for Oscar Crushing, giving this body to him, he would avenge him. On the outskirts of Siren, someone reports that they got news from the shop. Their boss asked to be addressed formally, and the subordinate apologizes, but the boss just wants to know the news. So the subordinate says that the shops were destroyed from the inside by a mage, and the boss slams his bottle on the table asking who did it. He explains that the mage was looking for the person who sold the elixir, and asks if it could have been Oscar Crushing, but the boss denies it. He was just a theoretical mage and couldn't have done that. The subordinate asks what they would do if the White Tower decided to investigate, and his leader questions whether he doesn't remember who ordered them to do that to Oscar. He was wearing a White Tower ring made for a mage. From there, Oscar asks what kind of stupid thing could be so obvious about where they came from, and the subordinate quickly turns around asking who that was. The young man appears at the window heading toward them. He reflects that he searched for the scent spark in the vial, and that more people were involved than he had thought. His boss asks if he really destroyed his shop, and Oscar confirms that he did. But he was interested in what the two were discussing, asking them to continue their conversation. The boss says he thought Oscar would pretend not to hear anything. He orders his subordinates to take Oscar's life. The man charges at Oscar drawing his sword, while the mage says that if that's the game they want to play, he won't back down, launching a gust of cutting wind toward the subordinate. The attack left cuts on his body, His head gone. Oscar thinks he can't believe that was all it took. The boss shouts Bart's name, pointing a weapon at Oscar and calling him a bastard. He fires 3 projectiles at the mage. Oscar comments that this was a bit interesting, using a windshield since he detects no mana, and he wants to know what principle is being used to produce such power. The boss yells that he stopped the bullets, and Oscar asks about the name because it was intriguing, and he would return it to him at the right time, repelling the projectiles back toward the boss. They strike his chest, stomach, and leg, making the man fall to the ground. While cursing him, Oscar approaches, stating that all sounds in the room have been blocked, so no one will come to rescue him. The boss asks how a mere level 1 mage could cast a level 5 silence spell, and Oscar says he used a sound link so that noises wouldn't escape, but he would appreciate it if he answered his questions, and wants to know who ordered the attempt on his life. The boss tells him to stop talking nonsense, but is interrupted by a kick to the face. Oscar comments that his pride is worth more than his life, and that it wasn't bad. He then receives some sort of spell on his body. He starts feeling immense pain all over. Oscar had connected the wind to his body, and it felt like thousands of needles piercing him from the inside. But he says he doesn't like playing with people's lives, so he should just talk. The man begs him to stop, saying he'll tell him everything. Oscar agrees and lifts the spell, ordering him to tell everything he knows about the patron. His boss says the patron gave him an elixir and some money, instructing them to sell to Oscar at a low price, which they accepted. Oscar asks what the man looked like. The man says he was wearing a hood so he couldn't see his face, but he was definitely wearing a white tower ring. Oscar questions this, thinking it was probably a strategy to deceive the man, but the boss says the man had a unique scent, like a fresh clear mint, and that's all he knew. Oscar asks what he would have done after taking his life, and the boss says it's been hard for the White Tower, since it was removed from the 4 main towers, and he doesn't know if they'll investigate. Oscar asks what he's talking about, and the boss wants to know if it wasn't something he was supposed to know. The mage uses the excuse that he forgot after taking the elixir, and the boss tells him to get the documents. He looks for the documents inside a drawer. He hands them over, saying they were the relevant documents. Oscar thinks that starting with the White Tower, April 28th was marked as the White Night because the high priest lost his life, and among all the towers it was the worst, and would have an important announcement on the White Night. Oscar reflects that the White Tower didn't have advanced magic, as he remembers Edna's documents, warning to prevent something like that from happening. He tells the boss to list the businesses of the 4 main magic towers. The Yellow Tower of the West controls electricity, and opened a great era of magical engineering, contributing to the creation of revolutionary items. The Blue Tower of the South contributed to drinking water, agriculture, and potions, and the Red Desert Tower of the East joined the military ranks, helping with monster suppression missions. Oscar asks about the White Tower. The boss says they do deliveries. The mage is baffled upon hearing that, asking if he meant deliveries, like item deliveries, and the man says that the mages of the White Tower can fly, and have an advantage in delivering items quickly. Oscar asks what that ridiculous thing he was hearing was, thinking that the mages of the White Tower fly high in the sky, and rule over it, being seen as symbols of freedom and bravery, compared to dragons and eagles. Oscar asks who came up with that absurd idea, and the boss says it was the current head of the White Tower. The mage reflects that it must have been his own brat. He asks about the agricultural industry and drinking water, and if potions weren't supposed to be the greatest source of profit for a magic tower, and why the Blue Tower had taken over that. The man says the Blue Tower monopolized potions, and Oscar remembers that the White Tower used to be the greatest, but lost everything when the methods were burned. So the boss explains they now sell water at high prices, and bring rain to drought-stricken areas. Oscar questions why people are buying pure water, and the man explains it's a recent madness of the rich. The mage complains that they're acting like clowns for a few extra bills and could just drink from the well, reflecting that the magic tower can't compare to the other towers, and it's true that the business growth of the others was bigger. The festival would be their last chance. The boss reminds Oscar about his body, and the mage thinks he's losing his life due to the shock and the blood he lost. Oscar reflects that they gave some useful information, and wonders whether he should save him, saying that arson attacks people, traffics illegal goods, extorts money and even commissions assassinations, and that he's basically walking garbage, jumping out the window without saying anything. Oscar walks off telling him to be a good person in his next life. At dawn in the White Tower, he enters a room saying he's tired, but can't believe he's exhausted just from using basic spells, and wants to know what kind of body this is, and whether in his current state he could use that magic. The magic that made Oscar Sage the greatest mage in human history. The Wind Archive, but it disperses and he says he can't use it yet. He needs to improve the condition of this body first, and start with a scan spell, because he needs to read more information about this body. Simultaneously, his memories were a mess, even though Frank gave him some info, but it was crucial to learn more about Oscar Crushing. If he wants to save this body, he was the heir of Count Crushing, and the sole survivor of a disastrous mansion fire. The entire magical world recognized him as a premature genius, and expectations were high with every faction trying to recruit him. In 6 years he entered the Imperial Magic Academy, but achieved nothing but magical theory grades. With the extraordinary thesis he published, it was easy to prove he was a genius, wondering how someone like that was still level 1. And that was because of misfortune, since he had mana deficiency syndrome, though he could have been a great mage, capable of representing his generation. Oscar repeats about that syndrome, and if it's true it makes sense that he's level 1, since he understands magic better than anyone, but can't use it. Oscar says the scan is complete, telling it to confirm the results and noticing something different, since he doesn't have mana deficiency. And Oscar, impressed, says it's not a disease, but that someone sealed his circuit. Mana deficiency syndrome prevents one from accumulating magic, and even with 20 circuits, someone with it can't get past level 3, because they can't establish a connection. So Oscar Crushing was a different case. His physical circuit wasn't innately twisted, it was bound deliberately by someone. If this guy was truly a genius, he should have known he didn't have mana deficiency syndrome. It would have been amazing if he wrote that in his journal. According to Frank, Oscar Crushing was an alcoholic, wondering if he could have been a character he created on purpose. He knew someone had blocked his circuit, and afterward behaved like a spoiled brat on purpose. If that's the case, it explains why he tried the illegal elixir, because in that situation, he wouldn't believe in anyone. Oscar needed to break the chains on himself. In contrast, he only needs to connect the bindings and he'd be able to do it. Finding a book among Oscar's completely marked up, a reinterpretation of basic magic. Oscar starts reading it, becoming aware of something from a different perspective. Some notes mention that the wind/trajectory is boring, and the windshield, which is a defensive spell, could be used offensively by analyzing weapon behavior. Oscar thinks the concept behind the advanced windshield was similar to how he was using it, completely different from the idea and principle of a defensive skill. Additionally, he wrote about how to use it in each situation, and there were many basic spells that he created himself. He couldn't perform magic on his own, but he carried out all those experiments in his mind, understanding that he was called a genius, since they were similar in how they interpreted theory. And in addition, just by looking at this single book, he could tell that he never gave up on magic, and worked harder than anyone else. And his passion screams that he loves magic. Reading the last sentence, said he hopes this book echoes through the faintest breeze of the White Tower, being from a mage who was facing his greatest challenge. Oscar thinks that he was aware because he knew everything, but he did all of this alone anyway, repeating the name Oscar Crushing as he rises from his chair, thinking that he was a young mage who didn't give up because of his cruel fate, and walks silently along the path alone. Sitting down on a couch in the room, Oscar swears in his name as the 17th master of the Magic Tower that he will untie the knot that he himself could not undo. Additionally, he will make those who broke his wings pay. Amid a greenhouse, Oscar walks, asking why he was going that way, reflecting that he remembers falling asleep from exhaustion after beginning to untie the knot in his physical circuit. But he hears someone calling for their master. Oscar Sage was sitting on the floor meeting with his disciples. The young man thinks this was caused by that cursed dream. The demon of the Viscount of Nightmares had placed a curse, where every time he sleeps, he remembers the past honestly. He had hoped the curse would be lifted after taking possession of this body, but it seemed that the curse was tied to his soul, not his body, wondering if he could be lucky, since the dreams about his students hadn't changed, and weren't just emotional pastimes. The children say what the teacher would say, and Oscar confirms explaining that magic, although physically the same, is divided into enhancement, acceleration, balance, and others. Lloyd says that the White Tower uses the harmonization type, and his master confirms since when magic was the best. Sasha asks if each magic tower has a preference for a magic type, and Oscar explains how different types of magic have different affinities. The Golden Tower values speed most, using acceleration. The Red Tower values fire, so it uses enhancement, and the Blue and White Towers use the balance type. Gillett shouts that he wants acceleration type magic because slow things are frustrating, and Oscar says unfortunately he can't choose. It's innate. Sasha asks how they know what they were born with, and her master says it's easier than she thinks, asking her to extend her index finger and use magic. The girl says it's her first time using that spell, and it would take some time, but her master doesn't rush her. So she uses magic and says something is coming. Oscar says it's the harmony type. The little girl asks if it's the same as her master's, and he confirms. She smiles and says she likes it. Juliet tries the same, and his master says that just as he wanted. It's the acceleration type. The little boy starts celebrating, and his master calls for Lloyd. Sasha says it's a beautiful flower, and Oscar explains it's a special type. Lloyd asks if he can change his type once it's been determined, and his master says it's a rare type found in less than 1% of mages, and asks why he would want to change it. The boy says he'd rather have the balanced type like his master, but his master starts grumbling, wondering what he should do, since he wanted to give Lloyd a larger number of private lessons, and wants to know what he would do if he gave him a new type. Boy repeats about the private lessons. His master confirms, since special type mages need more attention from their teacher, and the boy says the special type isn't bad, but his master must promise. So they make a pinky promise, and Oscar thinks of that brat Lloyd, since his nickname was the Promised Man. But no matter how mature he tried to be, he was still a child. A radio begins to play on the wall beside him, announcing that this is a message from the radio room, calling the mage Oscar Crucian, who must go to Laboratory 4202, and he wonders how long he had been asleep, since he has 8 physical circuits remaining. Additionally, when he unlocked his mana circuits, he gained 2 mana lines and is now level 2, wondering who would think he'd be happy about reaching level 2, and the elder Maxim asks how he's feeling, since according to Frank he seemed better. Oscar approaches and confirms while the elder nods, thinking that this elder was actually his junior, being Elder Maxim Bisk, 45 years old. Oscar reflects that Maxim entered the tower many years after him, but now he was old and an elder still. He was honest and diligent, so he would have a good future. He used to follow him, calling him senior and later master of the magic tower, which Oscar found cute, working hard because his magic reflected his former age, and Maxim asks what he was laughing about, but then says he received a report about Chief Gordon's family, and was acting as if his boss was losing his life. Maxim asks if he has anything to say about that, but Oscar denies it since he doesn't know the reasons for his death. However, it had been because he tried to take Oscar's life. The elixir had been poisoned, and there were commission bribes for his assassination. Maxim asks if that's why he did it. Oscar confirms, saying he tried to talk, but they tried to kill him, saying that money was completely legitimate. The book contains the contract proving it, and Maxim says he understands since it was in self-defense. Oscar says he's grateful but asks a personal favor from the elder, saying he'd like to meet the leader of the magic tower, and the elder closes his eyes, saying it's not difficult, since he's supposed to have magical discussions with her. Oscar thinks he used to discuss magic with Sasha, and the elder says he can meet her in 6 months. The young man is shocked, thinking that would be the night before the festival begins. Maxim explains she's on a work trip handling an important commission, and Oscar wants to know why the tower master is doing such a minor task. Says that the mage was absent and that's shameful, reflecting that because of that, Sasha has to go personally, and he apologizes for being rude, but wants to know the level of the tower master. Maxim says she is at level 7, and the boy realizes that at her age he was already a level 9, but she's still far off, though with her talent she should at least be level 8. The elder says they'll take care of the reports, and asks if he's been training offensive magic again. Oscar says he'll train when it comes to mine, and the elder allows him to leave. Someone approaches the door just as the boy is leaving. Maxim asks what brings the deputy tower leader here, and Hamel Glimwitz asks him not to be so strict with the child, but it seems it's too late. The elder says he'll need to scold him if he gets into trouble, and Hamel agrees but says he brought him there and cares about him, thinking that even basic magic can't be perfected in just a day or two. He was studying hard in secret, then calls Oscar a brat since he's working harder than he thought. Hamel asks if they should head to the elders' meeting, as Fatalina was waiting for them. So Oscar goes up to the 10th floor and walks, thinking he saw his students in his dream and wanted to go there, saying the place felt empty. As a gardener approaches, he says it's young Master Oscar. While the boy asks who he is, the gardener introduces himself as Walter, and says he manages the facilities of the magic tower. It seems the rumors about Oscar losing his memory were true, as they used to talk a lot. Oscar asks how far those rumors had spread, and questions what he means by young Master Oscar. Walter says he has worked there since the former tower master. Oscar Sage the boy is surprised to hear that, saying that's a good way to differentiate them, and he'll start using that too. Then asks if he can still be his conversation partner. Walter thanks him for the offer, but says it'll be hard as he's leaving the tower soon. Boy asks what he'll do, and the old man says he's worked there for 40 years. He served under 3 masters during his time, and his colleagues always changed, but he was the only one left in his department. The reason he stayed so long was because the former master, Oscar Sage, said something at his ceremony, saying that everyone living in the tower was needed. Oscar coughs, and the old man says it seemed amusing, but from that moment on he worked, believing he was a true member of the White Tower. The boy says it wasn't really funny, and the old man thanks him, saying that either way he'll be leaving. Oscar asks what he means by that, but the old man says that, as the young master knows, the tower has been struggling recently, especially with the facilities. The finances are not what they used to be. Next month he would have worked there for 40 years, and Oscar asks if it's about the long service reward. All tower members except mages receive a long service medal and a monetary reward in their 20th and 40th year of service, so he would receive 200,000. Walter says that the current tower doesn't have the money to pay that, and to do so, many people would have to risk their lives to complete commissions. He can't accept thinking like that, because no matter what people say, this place is his second home. Oscar thinks he didn't know it was that bad, but he thought the Azure Tower was doing strange things for money, wondering who he was to underestimate their work, since they had learned how to earn a lot of money, and were ahead in history. On the other hand, he has only titles: War Hero, Savior of Humanity. These were honorable titles, but they haven't brought rewards to the towers in decades, and so he is called out by Walter, asking why he was clenching his fist so tightly. Oscar asks when he plans to leave, and the old man says it would be in 2 weeks. He asks the young master to go to the infirmary and apply medicine to the wound. Oscar says he hopes he can continue being his conversation partner, because the old man doesn't need to leave. He's sure he'll make it happen, thinking he needs a method to make a lot of money, so this never happens again. Oscar then wonders how he would do that, since all he thinks about right now is research, reading, and commissions. But it would be a problem if payment takes too long, and he's still just a level 2 mage. Therefore, he needs a job that pays a lot, and potions are his only option. Noticing something different while reading the newspaper, he thinks about what he had seen in the Vice Master's office. Elder Felina comments that they can't ignore this time, because it was fraud, while Maxim says it was wrong. But the elder interrupts and asks what he means, and the old man says that the culprit is reflecting on it right now. Fidelina asks if he plans to let him go, since stealing is a habit that only gets worse, and Maxim asks her not to worry about it, since there's not much to steal from their tower anyway. The woman complains that he refutes everything she says, and tells them to put the boy in isolation. But the old man refuses, because it doesn't make sense to put a level 1 child through that. Emil says that just as Elder Maxim said, isolation training could be a bit harsh, since it would be nothing but a disturbance to the child's life. Instead, the boy should pay 3 times the money he used, and the elder asks if just 3 times is enough, and Hamel decides to move to the next topic of discussion, saying that they have very little money, and need to make a decision soon, since they had many and used facilities, and if they sold the potion production equipment, they could live well for at least 3 months. Hamel says he won't allow that, and the woman calls for the vice master, but he says it's a magic tower, where mages come to study magic and share knowledge. So there's no fresh air in a sealed room, and they can't sell their future to satisfy today's hunger. The elder asks if they even have a future, because they've been waiting for it for 20 years, and Maxim shouts her name. The woman tells the vice master to be honest, because even if there were a genius of that level to save the tower, he wouldn't come to them. Hamel tries to say something but is interrupted. The elder turns and asks who they are since they're in a meeting, and the old man tells him to come in. Oscar greets the elders and introduces himself. The vice master asks what he needs, and Oscar suggests something because he wants to start a business, and the elder shouts about it because he's hilarious, having stolen research funds just a few days ago, and now the mage wants to start a business. Oscar says he found an article while reading old newspapers, and says that the state of 20 is in quarantine, due to a terrible flu outbreak. Emil comments that he saw that too, and people say it must be Cadena flu, which is terrible news if it really is that flu. Currently there's no cure for Cadena flu, and in the past the White Tower had the vaccine, but the recipe was lost 20 years ago. Oscar says that's right, and the Azure Tower, which is dominating the potion market, could replicate, and he wants to start that. He says he wants to sell Cadena flu vaccines, since the White Tower had a monopoly in the past, and he wants to experience that. Vitalina says there was no need to listen to him. The Magic Tower and the pharmaceutical company invested tons of money in labs, but no one had been able to replicate the vaccine for the next 20 years, but a 20-year-old brat thinks he could do it. Oscar says everyone failed. He was a 20-year-old young man, but still he was a genius above all. Vitalina gets irritated, saying he took 723,000 coins and another 25,000 for illegal medicine, while a farmer earns 20,000 a year after taxes. But he was a genius with no idea what to do with money. Yet Hamel interrupts, calling out to Elder Fedelina, saying Oscar was there to propose an official investment as a mage of the White Tower, and knows she's in charge of finances. But she was being rude. The woman apologizes for that. Oscar says he was wondering why she hated him so much, but it made sense as she was the treasurer and he hadn't done anything for 2 years after all. But he says he's sure about this and asks the woman to consider, thinking that the owner of this body and himself are different. Hamel asks if he's sure it's Cadena flu, and Oscar confirms, asking him to take a look at page 2 of the newspaper. The elder reads that Archbishop Baldwin changed his plans for the pilgrimage, and Oscar says he'd stay in Siren for a month to request blessings, which was strange spending a month in major cities. The El Terra cult worships the mother of the planet Terra, and there were 7 archbishops considered worthy and incorruptible, but reality was far from that, since it took lots of payments to become cardinals, saying he remained in the state to visit the pilgrims for a month, but only met with nobles and merchants to get money from them. Siren was a big city in the past, even though it kept getting smaller. Maxim says he was right, and that the reason must be the prayer for blessings. Oscar says that's why it was even weirder. They were praying for arid lands, and as everyone knows, the Altera pilgrimage route had already been chosen: Siren Mosque, Melbourne and Greenwell, but after that, they were supposed to go to the state of Vince. Oscar says the Archbishop stayed in Knox for a month before coming to Siren, and if he's not mistaken he'd also spend a month in Mosque and so on, asking if it didn't seem like he was trying to avoid visiting Vince as much as possible, because if an incident happened during the pilgrimage, the people of Altero would say they angered the goddess, and that was the word of an archbishop. Maxim comments that Baldwin knows the flu is Cadena, and asks if the disease was taking too long to calm down, and Oscar says that's how it's been interpreted. The elder woman says it's a good analysis expected of a theory mage, but that's all for now. Hamel says he understands what he's saying, but he can't sponsor him officially, since they can't find other managers to do it. Hamel says he'll invest his own money personally. This time the elder won and shouts about the Tower Master, and Hamel says it's fine since it's just 30,000 coins, and asks if it's enough. Oscar repeats that, thinking it's not enough, not even close, heading to the potion production room, saying that now he has to go with plan B. He would make a simple vaccine with money, and get more from the Archbishop. He was the only one in trouble now because of Cadena flu, so it would be easier to get money from someone desperate. Now it was time to get ready, noticing something strange in front of him. A red potion was coming out of the flask, He says now is the time. Finally, after finishing, he says it wasn't bad at all. He thinks they say a true master always maintains his class, but he made an energy drink just for practice, and was worried it would go wrong. Frank yells that his back is going to break. Oscar asks if he found all the medicinal herbs, and Frank says obviously, and wants to know if he had anything to drink, because he felt like he was going to faint. So the young mage hands over the energy drink, and his friend thanks him, saying it was good and warm, and asks how he made that one. Oscar says the condition of the ingredients was excellent, and Frank says he picked the best ones and the seller was mad about it. So the mage says with eyes like his, he could be a merchant instead of a mage. And the guy says, he was thinking about doing that when the tower goes bankrupt, but Oscar punches the ground, saying he couldn't hold back the urge to do it. Frank asks what he should do since Elder Philomena asked him to help. Oscar thinks she's awful in front of him, and mentions starting to move those ingredients, thinking he didn't need an assistant. The current White Tower was full of problematic children, even if talented, and they would get lost along the way. But if these children could grow, they would contribute a lot. And one of them was Frank. Serious, and he assumes he was a perceptive person, but he was getting curious about this kid, as it was the perfect time to confirm. Frank says they were buying those herbs, but they were poisonous, being lilies of the valley, red camellias, ghost mushrooms, and merva leaves. Oscar says that just because they're poisonous doesn't mean they can't be used as medicine, and asks if he knows that. But Frank says they'll steep the herbs for 12 hours. He says he's right except for the problem with that method, as the nutrients are lost in the process, asking if Frank knows about the buns from the Yen dynasty, and the boy says yes, since he's seen them before, and to make them you need a smoke tool. Oscar explains that that same tool is used to detoxify herbs, and would preserve the nutrients. With that method, they'll be able to extract 98% of the ingredients' effects. And Frank questions that since they could monopolize potions, and Oscar says it's something from the old days. Frank asks about the end of the detox process, and the mage denies, saying the ingredients were only simplified to make the next step easier, because the process starts now using air-draining magic, and explains that now he needs to extract the toxins from the smoke separately, telling Frank to take a good look there. But the rest of the smoke would have no toxins, and they would be able to gather the toxins, with 23% from red camellias and 47% from merva leaves. There was the cure for Cadena flu, joking that it was easy to make, and Oscar says it's his turn to try now. Frank thinks it's easier said than done, since he doesn't even know how to use multiple spells at the same time and can't admit he doesn't know dual casting, and asks about the spell. Oscar thinks his mana control is unstable but not bad, but in the end that's all it is, asking if something went wrong, and Frank says he's teasing him because he still can't use dual casting, since you need to be level 4 or 5 to understand, and he's only level 3. Oscar says he'll teach him. Frank asks if he'll learn the secret technique, and Oscar says it's just trying to divide his mind into partitions. On the left side, he'll cast ballet, and on the right side he'll cast spell B, telling him to try it since he has nothing to lose. And Frank repeats the part about partitions, managing to dissipate the ingredient smoke. Frank shouts about it, and Oscar congratulates him on pulling it off. The blue-haired mage asks why they hide this technique for so long, and the young man explains it's because they're greedy, reflecting that they don't want to teach this technique because it's too much work to train disciples for free, and it became tradition but on a bloody battlefield. Tradition means nothing, and to survive, sharing techniques is necessary every day. The White Tower now needed interactive teaching and knowledge exchange. Oscar thinks he did a good job increasing his first bottle, saying the boy was quite talented, and he didn't expect him to succeed on the first try. Frank says it was because he explained it well, and the mage says he seemed angrier earlier. Then the blue-haired one crouches, saying they still have lots of ingredients and should start with them. Oscar sighs looking at his new friend, saying they have a large smoker and should extract them all at once, and the boy agrees. A few hours later, Frank is exhausted and Oscar counts 514 bottles in total. Maxim suddenly opens the door saying there's a problem, and the boy asks what it is. He shows a paper saying that the Azure Towers Pharmaceutical Company confirmed a visit in 1 hour. With Archbishop Baldwin, Maxim comments that they were a bit late, and Oscar reflects on how they were just buying time without a plan. Then the elder says that if they can hire them first, but Frank finishes by saying, Otherwise their remedy will become useless. Maxim tells him to lift his head, because there are times when life is unfair. But Oscar says it's not over yet, since if he remembers correctly, Kadena flu was classified as a rank B disaster, and if that's the case there's something to try. And Maxim asks if it's true, and Oscar confirms, asking if the elder flies faster than wagons in a certain lodging inn. Serin, a knock at the door, alerts the Archbishop that the mentioned visitors have arrived. Baldwin tells them to allow them in. Moraine, a level 5 mage from the Azure Tower, thanks him for allowing them in without issue. Along with director Neil Brand, Baldwin asks the two to sit, and Moira thanks him then. The Archbishop asks how the production of the Kadena flu medicine is going, and the man says it's going very well. Baldwin says that was expected from the Azure Tower, and wants to know when it's expected to be finished, and Moira explains they're still only in clinical trials. Neil says that with successful results, they'll get the Empire's permission for food and medicine. Administration Moira changes the subject, saying that, as he knows, clinical trials don't end in just a day or two, and Baldwin asks when they'll release the medicine. So the man from the Azure Tower says it'll be completed in half a year, and Baldwin repeats that, saying he'll be leading Vince in 4 months. And Moira tries to argue. Baldwin asks what's going on outside, and his guard says another mage came to visit him, but he wants to know why they didn't say someone else would be coming. And Moira apologizes, saying no one else was supposed to accompany them. All three want to know who that person is. Oscar opens the door, saying that, if he remembers correctly, Elza was the greeting of the order, introducing himself as Oscar Krushin, a level 2 mage from the White Tower, and he was there to make a good offer to him. Baldwin asks what brings him there. Oscar says he's there to sell the cure for the Kadena flu. The Archbishop says it's perfect timing, and that the other two were there for the same thing, and asks if he was late. But Baldwin denies it, since the two of them weren't prepared, and Oscar says it's a relief to hear that, because the White Tower is ready to negotiate now if necessary. Moira shouts that it's a lie, and that the White Tower has no money to develop a cure. The Archbishop asks for his last name, and the boy says it's Crushing, and so the cleric wants to know if he really has the cure. Oscar asks how he could dare lie to an Archbishop of the El Terra Order, opening a box and saying that inside was a sample. Baldwin asks if, in case they proceed with negotiations, they can produce many of those, and Moore tries to call the Archbishop, but the cleric asks what he was doing, saying he was unprepared, and the mage says they don't have the Empire's permission for Food and Drug Administration. Turning to Oscar and saying that it's clear, he wants to know if he got Imperial approval, and the boy says no. Morass says that, as expected, the White Tower is in no different situation from them, and they'll be able to produce the treatment in mass once approved. But she must also remember that they're talking about the White Tower, and considering the Azure Tower throughout history, they should be the ones to handle the treatment and develop the best medicine. Oscar complains that it was amusing to hear him talk about the Azure Tower's history in front of a White Tower mage. Moira gets irritated and tells him to step down now, but the young mage says that according to the continent's history, the White Tower was the first and the Azure Tower. Mage tries to argue that the difference was just 5 years. Oscar repeats that it was a small difference, but that same one is the gap every Azure Tower leader tried to close, and never could in 10,000 years. That's how history works. And he must have forgotten who monopolized potions just 20 years ago. Moira says that was in the past and no one remembers, but Oscar turns angry, repeating, no one remembers, and says, that's one way of thinking, while the members of the Azure Tower wonder about the aura of that. Level 2 Oscar says to make sure they remember, but a secretary opens the door, apologizing for the interruption, saying there was an urgent call. Baldwin asks who's calling, and the secretary says it's from the Lord of Vince. The call thanks the Archbishop for his immeasurable kindness, and Baldwin repeats that then the Lord of Vince explains that they received the cure for the Kadena flu. The elder of the White Tower said they prepared it in secret, and thanks must go to the Archbishop, because all the patients were cured within hours, and it was a miracle. Oscar starts smiling afterward. Baldwin says, that's good to hear, and wants to know about the side effects. And the Lord says there were none and it was incredible, but wants to know when they'll receive the second batch, because he asked the elder of the White Tower. But the elder said that was up to the Archbishop. The Archbishop said He would send the second shipment as soon as it was ready, but it shouldn't take too long. And the Lord thanked him for that. Ending the call, Baldwin asks if Oscar Crucian was the one who did this, and the boy replies yes. And it seemed everything went well. Morris slams the table and says, "This goes against FDA laws and he will be punished." But Oscar denies it since he probably doesn't know the rules, and wants to know if he understands how to win wars. But Mora tells him not to change the subject. Oscar reflects that this place should remain at peace for at least 20 years, saying that the equipment that took most lives in the war with the demons was a pandemic, even with mages rapidly producing treatments. It took a long time for FDA approval. His Majesty added Article 42. Clause 8 to the laws were starting with treating wounds in wartime. Special treatments could be used. But that didn't change the Empire's and the FDA's laws. Moyer says they were not at war. And Oscar responds that there are 3 cases considered war. The first is when fighting another species or nation. The second is during revolution. And lastly, when there is a Class B or higher disaster. Kadena flu was a natural Class B disaster, and that's why it was not necessary to follow FDA regulations. Neil says that if the White Tower did it, then they can too, and will send the treatment to the state of Vince immediately. The Archbishop says he doesn't understand the situation he's in, since the race ended the moment the treatment arrived in Vince. Baldwin says, the Lord of Vince thinks he was working with the White Tower, and now he can't backtrack and talk about the Azure Tower. Neil suggests lowering the price, but the religious man asks how he dares, since he wants to buy his image with money. And they try to deny it, but the man says that's enough, and doesn't want to hear anything else about it. And they both must leave immediately. Mora angrily gets up right after. As he walks out, he says he'll make Oscar pay for this, while the mage thinks he's acting like a villain from a book, responding that he's right, and that he registered the patent for the treatment and vaccine with the palace. Mora turns around in anger, and the boy tells him that if he wants the treatment, he better pay the licensing fees to the White Tower, otherwise he might as well throw out their potions. At that, the level 5 mage grits his teeth, leaving through the door completely furious. Neil bids farewell to the Archbishop, nods to Oscar in greeting. The boy feels something strange, as a certain scent passes through Neil's body. He remembers the boss talking about a unique scent, since it was refreshing and clear, like the smell of mint. That was all he knew. So Oscar looks toward the door in disbelief, and the Archbishop starts to laugh, asking the boy to sit down, saying they could finally talk, because they would now discuss the price first. As the Azure Tower and Newtek had asked for 2 million coins. Oscar smiles, saying if they want to, then they'll get just 5 million. The Archbishop bursts out laughing, asking if he's serious. Of a few hours later at the White Tower, someone asks what that was. The elder, astonished, shouts that it was 10 million coins, repeating that amount while Oscar smiles. Fidelina hugs him and thanks the brat. And Maxim says he believed in him from the start. Hamel says it's amazing and wants to know what happened, since not even the Archbishop could afford that much. Oscar says there were additional fees and the master asks about that. Then the young mage explains about commercial licensing fees. Hamel asks about it and the boy confirms, saying the White Tower's official announcement could be a revelation, to quickly prepare the antidotes. But because he's aiming for the position of cardinal, after receiving a revelation from Mother Earth, the title of Archbishop could be appealing to him. Oscar says he liked that, and he wanted to pay 1 million coins for the contract, and in return, he said he would send the vaccines and antidotes within a week. Amel says that's incredible, because the disciplinary action asked for 3 times the value of the stolen funds, but he brought back more than 400,000 times that amount, saying that disciplinary measures would end there, and asking if anyone objects, and Fidelina agrees. So the vice master says that if Oscar needs support, he can come to him, and the boy says they need to bring in level 4 or higher mages as soon as possible. Hamel agrees because she's going to go out looking for volunteers, and asks Elder Fight Lena to announce it, together with the magic tower. The woman asks what she should say, but the master explains that she should mention that the potion production is looking for mages, level 4 or higher, and they'll be paid and receive a meat meal. A few hours later in the potion production lab, some mages gather interested in the meat and saying it was amazing. Oscar claps his hands and calls the seniors' attention, asking them to listen. The people continue ignoring him even after that, but the mage snaps his fingers, activating a sound spell, and the seniors ask what that buzzing sound was. Oscar asks for everyone's attention, because the reason he brought them there was to create antidotes for the Cadena flu vaccine, and he needs their help. The students wonder why it's the fallen genius, and if it's another scam involving medicine. That boy is stunned by the gossip. He asks Frank if they don't like him and why, but Frank says he should think about everything he's done so far, because his personality is annoying and arrogant. He wasted tower resources, did no research, and all he did was drink alcohol. Oscar wonders if he was really like that, but a blonde girl approaches and asks if she can ask a few questions, since the White Tower's production methods were lost, and she wants to know how they plan to do this. Oscar says they've recovered the methods, and the students keep gossiping, while the blonde girl asks if the antidote's effects were proven. Then Krushin confirms and says the contract with the order had also been made, and the blonde girl says that must be worth a fortune. If it leaks, the meat will be a joke, asking if he really trusts them enough to share such valuable information. Oscar replies that, to be honest, he doesn't even know why they're all still in the tower. The blonde asks if that's the attitude of someone asking a favor from their seniors, because he just wasted her time, and she doesn't know what intentions others have with what this amazing genius is saying. But no one there wanted to hear it. Oscar says he knows exactly what each of them gave up for the White Tower. The blonde turns stunned, but the mage recites her information. Level 5 mage Lena White, 25 years old, who had 7 organizations try to recruit her due to her judgment, talent, all unsuccessfully. He starts mentioning other seniors like Herak Dion, 26 years old, and Descartes Rin, the same age. Finally, he talks about Cephia Rose, 23 years old, who had many skills in alchemy. Oscar says the others besides the ones he mentioned had similar offers, and if an offer like that had come to him, he doesn't know how he could have refused. But none of them abandoned this place. Lena asks if the elders know everything about this secret meeting. Oscar confirms, saying they had no choice if they plan on this, because none of them want to overburden the students. The White Tower was currently facing the coldest winter it had ever experienced. Given the situation, they all chose to remain in the cold. If he can't believe in people like them, he wonders who he could possibly believe in. But if they didn't like it, there was no reason to help. Frank complains that he's pretending, but Oscar continues, saying that level 2s have to work. His friend yells that he's talking about him, and Oscar tells Frank to hurry up, because he only needs 2 of them to get started. Lena stares at the boy while putting on a visor. Then she coughs and steps forward, and asks if she should just put on those safety goggles. Eric asks what they need to do to start, and Cephia tells the others to get started already. Frank says he must be dreaming if he thinks Oscar convinced people with just words, and the mage says it wasn't that bad. But he likes to mention in advance that the meat won't be pork, and the students start guessing whether it's chicken or rat. The mage says it'll be beef, and everyone cheers in celebration because of it. And so the vaccines and antidotes were created, reaching 140% of the original goal. A week later, Oscar walks through the greenhouse but notices petals on the ground, wondering if it's something that old man Walter did, because he must have come back, and he's sure Hamill found him and brought him back. Then he starts reading a newspaper while sitting at the greenhouse table. It says the territory events announced the end of the pandemic 2 days after the Cadena flu antidote, and Oscar Crushing was considered a candidate for the peace building. The boy thinks everything is going according to his plan, as Frank approaches, calling his friend, saying it was incredible because vaccine orders were skyrocketing, wanting to know if he saw that list with desert territories, the order, and even the imperial family, where millions no longer meant anything. And Oscar says everyone needs the vaccine. Frank says the wave will cool down, and the mage says he's clever for knowing demand is finite. The blue-haired one asks who will buy the vaccine later, since it'll take years. Oscar replies that he doesn't need to worry about money, because he prepared potions for every level of demand. And Frank shouts that he really has a plan, and those were the star tears he heard about in the rumors. But Crushing says no, because the potions they would sell were low and mid-tier, and it's not time yet. The star tiers are famous regeneration potions from the White Tower, miraculous enough to bring someone back to life, and creating them would be amazing. Oscar thinks that doing so would only make Dantinas try to steal the production method, because he's protected thanks to the Archbishop's shield, but he needs to grow stronger. So he says that now, as mentioned, they should go after the precise materials, and Frank says he never mentioned that. Oscar lists lantern leaves and Pisces stalks. Frank complains about how hard that is, but the mage says they're specialties, while the blue-haired one disagrees, saying that hasn't been true for a while, and that it's been some time since the herb fields disappeared. Frank complains that Oscar must be crazy, because he really came all this way not believing him. The blue-haired one complains that they're walking when there's a carriage, but the young mage says the carriage doesn't go that far, and they should wait just a bit more. They've already walked 10 miles and are almost there, and Frank asks why he's using a unit that doesn't exist anymore. Oscar asks if they no longer use miles, and his friend says distances are now measured in meters since the war, and pounds are now grams. Crushing thinks they changed pounds too, and they were harder to calculate, but doing all that made it more fun, and he enjoyed miles and pounds while they lasted. But Frank says there's a cabin ahead, wondering if anyone was around. An old man opens the door asking if they walked all the way there. Frank says yes, because the carriage only brought them to the entrance, and Oscar wants to know what that was, as a carriage full of men in suits approaches the cabin, parking in front of the flowers, while a man in a suit asks the old man if he's ready to sell his land. Today the old man steps out of his cabin, angrily walking up to the suited man, wondering if it wasn't time for him to stop being an idiot, and the old man replies that not unless he's offering the miserable castle. Dever Pavlov, the businessman, says that acting like this was cute only in the early days, but if he lives like that, no one will ever acknowledge him. Ivan the herb master says that's none of his business. Ever tries to say he's doing this for him, that he should hurry up, sell and enjoy a comfortable life because land prices will drop soon. However, Ivan replies that it's funny because with him around, permits for factories will never be granted. The businessman stays silent for a few seconds, but tells his guys to hurry up. Then as he walks back to the car, he remembers something, saying that he stepped on some herbs on the way and should pay for them, throwing the money back on the ground. Dever comments in the car that the guys near the old man were from the White Tower, and asks what they were doing there. The subordinate says it's herbs since they've made a lot from vaccines. The businessman asks how much they must have made, and his subordinate hands him a newspaper saying it was a lot. Dever reads the news without saying much, but slaps the subordinate on the head, complaining and asking why he's only saying this now, thinking that if the old man gets support from the White Tower, he'll spend more years refusing to sell the land, and that can't happen as it'll make things harder for him. So he calls his subordinate, who answers, never asks if he still has the mercenaries he contacted earlier, because they're going to pay them, and his subordinate asks which team was commissioned, since they might have recognized them, but the man slaps him on the head again, saying, they just need to take the old man's life and mark him as missing, to claim the land, thinking that it would look a little suspicious. But he also has backing, and his subordinate asks, what if the White Tower stays at the herb farm? Because if the 4 main magic towers get involved, it'll be much harder to handle Ivan. But Dever asks what could possibly happen, because the phrase about the 4 main magic towers was old to begin with, since the White Tower was turning to dust. Frank lies down on the grass, saying the old herbalist was a good person for letting them stay and sleep there since it was late, and also fed them. Oscar agrees while smiling at the starry sky, remembering Ivan saying it was late and they should sleep there. Frank asks if it was okay, and the old man replied that he had loyalty to the White Tower to uphold. Oscar thinks about that. The blue-haired boy asks who it was before, and Ivan answers that it was a bastard named Dever, who threatens and even takes lives. 3 years ago, he started buying everything on that land and got it all, except for Ivan's area, and many people left the city. Frank asks what the purpose was, and Ivan talks about factory. Oscar asks why he put up with it, and the old man says that bastard couldn't touch him since he was at a disadvantage. He is a cultural human heritage of herbal cultivation. Frank says he receives protection from the imperial family, and the old man confirms while Oscar asks why he doesn't just sell. He'd make a fortune if he did. Ivan says he's just stating the obvious because he loves that land, which has been his home since he was born, and will be his home until his last breath. Oscar says he's a good person, and Frank comments, "It was cute when he ran inside the house embarrassed, but the stars were beautiful out there and he felt jealous." His friend asks of what. Frank explains that he wanted to live like a shining star, but he's sure a genius like Oscar wouldn't understand. Oscar says he's underestimating himself, and his friend simply thanks him. Even if the words are empty, Crushing says they're not empty, because he's not the kind of person who gives empty words. In the first place, thinking that honestly, he doesn't understand why young Oscar said this guy was problematic. And Frank says the stars were beautiful. Oscar says that before they could see the stars in the middle of Siren, thinking that because it's bright at night, thanks to the street lights, we can't see them anymore, and it's a kind of inconvenience for romantics. Frank asks how long it's been since then, and wonders if Oscar could really revive the herb industry in Siren. Oscar says it's not impossible. They just need to talk about the details with Elder Ivan. He senses something different in the aura of the place, suddenly standing up while Frank asks if he saw a ghost. But Oscar says they're people. For of them to be exact, Frank says he didn't feel anything. Oscar reflects that for someone at Frank's level with good mana sense, not to notice them means they have bad intentions, and tells his friend to get up to meet the visitors. A man blows a bubblegum bubble as he walks forward, asking what happened since they were definitely refused, when they should have taken the old man's life earlier. Endeavor was a coward. An old man asks, "Who cares if it pays? They do it." And the man says, "The old man is famous in the north and even has a bounty." But he was being passive. Then a man in a red jacket approaches saying, "That's enough talking and they shouldn't let their guard down." The Shooter Jack gang says there must be mages, while the old man says it's a relief if they're from the White Tower. It would have been harder if they were from the others. Then the green-haired man spins his key asking if they should go in, thinking it was quiet and wondering if the old man was already asleep. He goes to the bed thinking it's boringly easy and there are no mages. What a waste, but he notices something strange there, cursing the situation as he turns around. Oscar says he's unnecessarily sharp and fires a wind bullet, hitting the green-haired man in the head. Oscar gets out from under the blanket and says, "The wind bullet was useful." A spell that young Oscar wrote in his reinterpretation of basic magic, an attack that reimagines wind magic, saying its killing power was greater than expected, and there should be 3 left. But he notices something different in front of him, because there were only 2, and Jack asks what the mage did to Max. Oscar replies that he was sleeping in there, and would probably stay that way for a while. Probably for all eternity. The old man says he was a pathetic bastard, and told him not to lower his guard, and Jack demands the herbalist location, because he has no hard feelings about Max. Oscar realizes they avoided provocations and unnecessary fights, acting professionally, and warns they'll talk. But Jack says if it's blood he wants, orders the old man to take his life. And so the man lunges forward with a dagger that hits the shield. The knife is knocked a bit away, and Oscar uses this chance to charge forward. The old man turns with a smile, saying it was impressive as Oscar walks. He raises his spear to attack once more, while Oscar prepares his magic. The old man splits the spear into 2 parts, saying it was a unique weapon and Oscar had no luck. But now it was over, bringing the attack to Oscar's forehead. The young man simply flicks his finger, saying this was even more boring, and cast his magic, adding that it was worse than he had thought. The wind strikes surge toward the blade. The old man thinks it can't be, for in a situation where he's caught off guard, he wouldn't be shaken, but instead Oscar fired in a sophisticated way, shattering the blade. Oscar comments that a unique weapon means nothing if it's not new. However, he noticed something different. Oscar instinctively retreats, as the old man says he was falling just after winning. A weapon was ready to fire, hitting the old mercenary in the head, then heading toward Oscar. Grazing him, the young man's face is slightly injured, as Jack warns that it was a waste, since if Oscar had let his guard down just a bit more, it would have taken his life. Oscar asks about his comrade, but Jack says he was his subordinate and easily replaceable. The mage thinks that's why criminals are terrible, and asks what that toy was. Jack says he'd be sad to call it a toy since it was very expensive. Oscar says that acceleration, enchantment, and penetration were 3 spells imbued in the weapon. The redhead asks how he knew that. Oscar says that's why he couldn't block it, Jack says he's arrogant but talented enough to back it up, asks if he'd like to work with him, saying the pay is good, and Oscar declines while standing up because he thinks his head would start itching. And Jack says that's true, but there's no more need for conversation now. Oscar hides behind fences, wondering what kind of condition the former master of the magic tower was in, since he escaped the named weapon. Since his wind bullets are slower than projectiles, the battle was at a disadvantage. He only had half his mana left, and the only opening was the window of time while Jack was reloading, since after firing his bullets, he had to reload, which took 1.4 seconds. The man walks across the field wondering where the rat went, and Oscar says he has only one bullet left to end this in 1.24 seconds, so he uses acceleration magic to dash toward the man. Jack turns to the mage saying he really was fast, but a human can't defeat this. Trinity then fires against the young man's windshield. Jack says it's over, but his projectile curves around the shield. Oscar continues advancing toward the man. Jack wonders how, since he shouldn't be able to dodge that bullet, with acceleration magic, wondering if it was because of the shield. While the young man points his hand toward the man's forehead, Jack asks how a low-level mage. Oscar questions if he would even understand if he explained, then sighs deeply at what happened, since he had used an annoying piece of equipment earlier, wondering if they called the Trinity those 3 spells bound to the weapon. His weapon was incredible, because it would be hard for Oscar to fight it otherwise, since he used friction to reduce the durability of the enchantment. On the windshield, the outer layer was flexible and the inner one hard, so the bullet didn't pierce the barrier, and if that hadn't worked, he'd be the one on the ground. So when he returns to the tower, he'll study how to use magic in modern weapons, feeling the limits of his weak body, because it's clear he needs to save Frank safely. And even before that, there was someone he sensed at the beginning, and since he's already dealt with 3 of them, he hopes Frank won't be captured and can just wait a little longer. The mage tells the elder to go ahead, and Ivan asks about him, and the young man replies that he's a bit strong, because he couldn't fight properly with him there. He'd catch up soon. Ivan agrees to the request, telling him to be careful. The mercenary asks if he enjoyed the goodbyes, and Frank wants to know if he's not going after the old man. That bandit says he sent the old man thinking he might survive, because he was his target, but was curious why everyone was so scared of the mages from the 4 main magic towers. Then he draws his sword, saying he wanted to take the mage's life first. He leaps forward. Frank fires a few cutting wind blasts at the mercenary, but they are deflected by a slash of the man's sword, who says it was too easy. He then tries to strike Frank's chest, telling him to do something fun, asking if that's all a mage from the 4 great magic towers can do. He notices something strange, as the sensation of his sword piercing something was absent. There was something odd as Frank grabs the sword, delivering a wind slash just below the man's neck. He falls to the ground as Frank apologizes, saying his constitution is a bit different, with a strange sound in his chest. Frank reacts with surprise as the body hits the ground. Oscar watches the fight from afar with his weapon, thinking Frank was a special kind of mage, and that was the god of wind, which allows Frank to turn any part of his body into wind, since physical attacks don't work on him. This kind of ability can't be beaten without magic or aura blade. He'd only read about this in books, and those memories were from the 7th master of the tower, a special mage who had that innate magic, but he never thought Frank could have it. This caught his attention. Frank asks when he got there, and Oscar congratulates him on the good work because he was worried, but he asks where Ivan went for Frank to be so triumphant, and the young man remembers the old man asking where he was, since he should be back. Oscar reflects that, if he trains Frank properly, his ability could be stronger than dozens of high-level mages, so he tells him where Ivan's energy is coming from. The old man thanks both of them, saying that if it weren't for them, he wouldn't have seen another tomorrow. And Frank questions what he did, since it was all Oscar, but the mage denies it, since he lost to the swordsman, and without Frank, everyone would be in danger. He repeats something in Latin. Frank becomes embarrassed upon hearing that, saying it's all over now anyway, but Ivan warns not exactly, because Divoire isn't the kind of bastard to give up easily, and if assassins don't work, he would find another method. Frank asks why he's so obsessed with that land, and Ivan says it's the best and largest land in Sirens. Sirens' fertility has dropped in the last 8 years. As a result, factories for magical engineering production have emerged and dump waste into the river daily, worsening the soil since Sirens' land fertility can't be recovered. He has no energy to grow herbs. Oscar says he has a question for the elder. He wants to know if the loyalty he kept to the White Tower referred to the promise of the fourth master of the tower. Reynolds eyes and Ivan asks if he knew about that. It was a story from the herbalists of the past. Long ago, perceptions of them were very different, and they were called witches. Since herbs had no known effects, they boiled them in pots and sold them. So herbalists avoided others and lived a nomadic life. But a savior appeared before them. Someone famous in their eyes, the fourth master of the White Tower. Reynolds eyes told the herbalist to go to Siren, which would become an eternal home for them and their descendants. Oscar adds that they wouldn't be seen as conquered there. Ivan says he said something so moving, and the boy says he read about it in a history book, reflecting on the old book of Tower Masters. The old man says that after that, herbalists from across the continent began gathering in Saran, and it was the first time the nomads had a home. The White Tower gave their ancestors a home and pride, so they would never abandon the White Tower. Oscar looks at that without reaction, thanking him for his hard work all this time, saying the White Tower would be with him from now on. Ivan asks what the method is, because if the imperial family thinks they attacked a cultural, human heritage, they would act immediately. But they can't leave here since the imperial family is slow, and if Devor attacks with full force. But Oscar interrupts, saying the imperial family will act quickly, since he is signing a treatment contract for the flu with the imperial family in Devor Powell's office. He orders his employee to hurry, because he messed up the work so badly it's heading toward bankruptcy. And after they run, the subordinate will go to heaven. But then the door is kicked in, and some soldiers order them not to move. The chief introduces himself as Walker, superintendent of internal affairs of the imperial family, and says he must be Divoire Paul, for he was being arrested for attempted murder, bribery, attempted illegal acquisition, and damage to cultural human property. Divoire says they got the wrong person and that he was a decent man. The Walker tells him to shut up, because they would be the ones to judge, that the man in the suit thinks he can't handle this alone, and that if he could contact that person, he'd be able to escape from there. He asks if the guard would give him time to smoke his cigarette. Walker stays silent for a few seconds, then orders them to put him in handcuffs and take him away. Deaver says he's making a mistake, because they don't know who's behind him, and Walker replies that he really doesn't know. But the one behind him is the Emperor, asking if that person is more important than His Majesty. Then they take the cigarette from Divoire's hand. Walker smokes a cigar, saying that bastard criminals had good taste, and his subordinate says he has a question. He wants to know who the guy was that got them moving on a day like this. But Walker just says it was an order from above, since their emperor truly loves the White Tower, and this was an affair between adults. He doesn't know why he loves them so much, if it's true they're heroes. But it's been 20 years already. If you release a bird with broken wings into the sky, the only thing that changes is how fast it falls, and the White Tower has no ability to deserve that kind of treatment. Then he asks how old his subordinate is, and he says he's 23, so Walker says he was 3 years old at the time, saying that he himself was 12 then. Time when humanity gained freedom after defeating the demons, wondering what kind of existence the White Tower really was, because the highest he could remember no longer lived up to his expectations. Then he says they should go soon, because they had one more place to visit, and his subordinate complains that he thought this was the last stop of the day, but he wants to know what their destination is, and Walker says they'll handle it and go home, since they were heading west to shut down the factories dumping waste, reflecting that something had been added to his mission, and he didn't know about the White Tower. Oscar crushing and Frank serious, but he would repay them for dealing with the shooter. Jack Gang, his subordinate, asks if they could buy food on the way, and Walker says no. Oscar congratulates Frank on the good work, and Frank asks if they can have a drink. But the young man says they have to report to the vice leader. Frank tries to speak, but the vice leader calls Oscar from behind, leaving the blue-haired boy stunned, saying he had something planned and then suddenly walking away. Hamill says he saw Frank, but maybe it was a mistake, and Oscar replies that the vice leader was right. He left to do something important, The old man says it must be something urgent as usual, and the young mage solved something big again. This time because he hear the report in his office, and Oscar says he was already on the way. So they decide to go together in an elevator heading to Hamel's office. Oscar wonders if something was wrong. Hamel asks if he heard anything from Frank. The young man says no but wants to know if something is wrong, and the old man explains he received a message from the Sirius family, saying they would take Frank back. Oscar asks if he already agreed to leave the White Tower. Hamel says they already finished speaking with him, but he still didn't know the details about it. Knock on Frank's door. Makes a mask if it's Grank and tells them to come in. Oscar asks who Grank is, to the young master of the Empire's largest trading company, and Frank complains that he heard everything. The mage asks if he was going to leave the White Tower, and the boy apologizes for not saying anything earlier, but he needs to return to his position and help the company. Until he gets married, Oscar asks if he started dating, and Frank says that apparently she's a good person from a good family, and she's pretty so it's fine. But Oscar says that's not the point. But if he's really okay with giving up on magic, Frank asks what he could do since that was his only talent. Honestly, he thought he was special. But he's one of the weakest in the magic tower, and at least could become the head of the snake. Since that's not the case, he already knew because he can't stay there, and understands his family's perspective about returning. But Oscar calls Frank again. He asks why he's calling him so strangely, and if it's because he called the tower weak. But Oscar says he's talented, warming Frank's heart upon hearing that. He thanks him for hearing that from a genius while on his way out, and Oscar asks if he wants to try to become the head of the snake. But someone enters the room and calls for Frank. The man asks if Oscar is his friend, saying he'd give his brother 5 minutes to hurry and meet him, as he'd be waiting so he can continue with his goodbyes. But Oscar asks how much he wanted for Frank to stay at the tower. Frank asks who he is to say that, and Oscar introduces himself, making the man recognize him as the mage who made the medicine. So he introduces himself too, as Grant Sirius, the older brother of that fool. Oscar says he was going to make an offer, but Grank says he's reckless and that he heard Oscar was a genius, asking if that's the reason, and how bold he must be to try to make a deal with the Sirius family. And Oscar replies it wouldn't be a loss for either side, since he would turn Frank into one of the best mages in the tower in just 2 years, and in the long run, it would be a huge benefit for the family. Grang repeats that and asks what the penalty for failure would be, and the mage says he'd give up 50 years of profits from the Cadena flu vaccine. To Sirius then, the older man asks if he has the authority to do that, and Oscar states he is notable to the vice master of the tower. Grank asks if the reason was because Frank was worthy, or just due to friendship. Oscar answers that it was obviously because he is extremely talented, since he plans to restore the White Tower's reputation in under 5 years, and this was only the beginning, and to do that he needs Frank Sirius, because he is necessary in the new White Tower he envisions. Grant says he's young, but for a merchant, there's no reason to avoid an enemy's foolishness, but he would add one condition. Oscar says his offer was already good, and Grank agrees but says there's something he forgot, since human merchants value trust more than money, and he won't make deals with anyone until they prove themselves. He has a level 5 knight as a guard, and tomorrow the boy would fight him. But Oscar asks if he knows he's a level 2 mage. Frank states that, as a condition, his guard can't use the keysword, so the young mage thinks he won't give up easily, since there's a strategic marriage at stake. Then the older man says goodbye until noon, but if Oscar doesn't show up, he'll take it as a surrender. Oscar thinks that even he would struggle against a level 5, and Frank asks what he'll do since he could cancel if he says so now, since his brother is saying he'll knock him out for being weak. But if his friend is too embarrassed to ask, he'll go with him. Oscar says he could do that since a level 4 mage could, while Frank complains about it, asking how he plans to reach level 4 in one day. But his friend says it's impossible for himself, but it is possible for a level 3 mage to reach level 4, since his brother didn't say he had to win the battle himself, only to prove his skill so he would show it, calling out the name Frank Sirius, because he would make him a level 4 mage if he fought in his place. In the training room of the tower on the 40th floor, Frank complains that he doesn't know how to do that in one day, when he couldn't in years. And Oscar says it's possible, since he must keep his body in a natural posture. Close his eyes and circulate mana through everything. Oscar says it looks good touching some points on his friend's body, and saying those areas are lost when he circulates mana, and because of that the magic level drops. And Frank asks if all geniuses see this, and wants to know if he could level up by improving that. But Oscar says it didn't matter with his level, as most mages didn't even care. But those in the less than 1% called archmages did care. So starting today he would train every morning, explaining everything he should do to improve his mana in his circuits, as it should be as natural as breathing. And Frank asks if that's all he has to do. But the boy says no and tells him to show it now, the magic he used in the herb field fight. Frank says he can't. Oscar thinks he didn't trust him, but his friend denies it, saying it wasn't about trust, but because he was afraid of that. And his friend repeats it again. Frank explains that he almost lost his life using that magic before, since he became more anxious as an adult, but because his family would mock him if he didn't show results. As a mage he thought he could do something others couldn't replicate, saying that if it wasn't just a part of his body, but his whole body could turn into wind, then he would become incredibly strong. But it was a reckless thought because at first he thought it worked, but then he noticed something strange. His whole body was turning into wind and disappearing. It was a failure, and after half of his body turned into wind, his mana went out of control. He screamed for someone to save him. If it weren't for the tower master passing by, he would have lost his life and even his existence, and the feeling of his soul being shattered into millions of pieces. He never wanted to feel that again. Oscar says he used it on the hill, and Frank warns that it activates automatically in dangerous situations, but it was pathetic, and Oscar disagrees, saying he shouldn't think like that. Most mages face problems like that, and the solution is simple. In his case, his ability is to control his mana. He just needs to improve that. And Frank says mana control is pure talent. Oscar says that's true most of the time, but there's a way to forcibly gain that ability. Then draws a circle on the ground. Frank asks if he's going to make a contract with a demon, but the boy says no, that they wouldn't come even if he called. He was going to summon a wind spirit to transplant into his body. Frank introduced himself to the wind spirit, asking it to embody purity within him, but nothing happens. And Oscar says his affinity with spirits is terrible. The boy says he felt a bit of wind just now, but his friend says it was just his sigh. Frank complains about that, and Oscar tells him not to be disappointed, because only a small number of humans have affinity with spirits. His friend asks why he shouted from the beginning, since if he can't summon a spirit, he won't control his mana. But the mage says he has another method, the spirit summoning ceremony. He learned when he visited the elf kingdom in his past life, and for fun he managed it, and this time it would work again. Frank asks if he should recite the chant again, but his friend tells him to step aside because he's going to try, thinking that the king of spirits will remember him. Oscar closes his eyes, thinking it's not a desolate training room like this one, but standing before the gigantic world tree. Then he calls to the wind spirit and tells it to come to him. Frank wonders what that was and if he succeeded on the first try. The wind spirit asks if that was the human who summoned him, because it was the first time in 27 years that he had been called. Oscar thinks it was the same and says he wishes for a contract, asking if anything is required. The spirit says something formal like that isn't needed, asking if this human wants to make a friendship bond with the highest-ranking spirit Celestine. And Oscar says no, saying he should have started with that. He doesn't need a spirit, and summon the king of spirits for his friend's sake. The next day in the duel hall, Grank asks if the vice leader slept well, and Hamel agrees. So the young master asks if he's fine with the schedule. The old man agrees and says the creator of the cure was very stubborn. Grank presents the knight who would fight today, and the redhead says his name is Lasley Morgan, level 5 knight, and Oscar introduces himself. Grank explains the content of the duel. It's a simple method, where whoever removes the opponent's necklace first wins, and if they don't win within 5 minutes, it would be a loss for him. Oscar says that's fine and they would begin. So Grank warns that if he wants to suspend the duel, he should raise his hand, and asks if he's okay with that outfit. The boy says it's fine because he wouldn't be the one to fight. Frank stands face to face with his brother. Frank is surprised and asks what that meant. Oscar says he was told to prove his ability not to fight personally, and that he trained his friend yesterday. The older brother admits it was his mistake not to add a condition, that the mage should fight personally, but asks if he expected him to go easy on Frank. Crushing says no. He simply thought a level 4 mage has a better chance than a level 2 one. And Grank repeats level 4. Wasn't he level 3 yesterday? Oscar says that, in order to make Frank one of the best mages in 2 years, he needs to show this much skill. Grank tells Lastly not to go easy on him and his knight agrees. Oscar pats Frank on the back and tells him not to be scared, because if he does everything he heard yesterday, he will definitely win. The blue-haired one agrees with him, saying that he would come back. Lastly says it's been a while and his young master agrees, so they decide to begin the duel with Frank stepping back, seeking a distance of 20 meters. But he notices something different because the pressure from Lastly. Even without the key sword at this distance, he was still that strong, and that was being a class 5. Wondering if he should say he can't do this now. Oscar notices his comrade's hesitation, and Frank remembers something, because Oscar had said before that he needed him, since he was someone he had in mind for his new tower, and that he lost the swordsman. But without his comrade they'd be in trouble. Frank prepares his fist, watching a blade of wind toward the knight. He thinks he would do this since, for the first time in his life, someone had said they needed him, so he can't let their expectations fall. As Lastly deflects the blades with his sword, thinking he got better, because he was using jewel casting and dispersing his momentum, wondering if he was trying to use the sword control technique from the Eastern nation, but he blocks the last strike with the blade. The wind blade stops in midair as Lastly advances. Thinking he has seen enough, Frank says he was too fast, and to block that, he creates a wind palm with his blade magic. Frank asks how he grew so much in half a day, and if they used a forbidden method for it. Oscar says he doesn't need to worry because they used a safe method, because he really did grow a lot. But that was all since Frank doesn't have the style of the battle mage, and since he's weaker than the others. Growing would hurt him, and it would be a relief. It was better for him to stay in the corporation than to get hurt and make his family worry. He would never try to grow his magic again. But Lastly gets close to grabbing the blue necklace. Oscar smiles and says it's over. Grant quickly turns to his comrade, wondering why he was smiling the night before. Oscar said the spirit transplant was successful, and asked if he could use his wind god magic. Frank said it now felt natural. The mage says he can't transform his body into wind yet, since he hasn't completed his trauma. Frank asks if there's no chance of winning tomorrow, but Oscar denies it, saying, if he uses the wind god, the chance will be 100%. Asking what he thought about turning the body into wind, Frank then asks if there's anything else. And his teacher warns him about an interesting part, because it's the most powerful of all unification. This ability transforms everything he switches on his body, whether items or clothes, into wind. And it was the most absurd part of the wind god. It was important to keep his trump cards hidden until the end of the battle, because if he won like that, it would be more fun dodging Lastly's strike. Frank moves forward, pulling the necklace from the knight's hand, who is impressed and says there was no other way. He places the necklace in his right hand, which suddenly begins to shine. Frank shouts that he finally did it. Grank stands up, thinking that even a magic healer had said he would never be able to use that again. Hamalas saying the match had reached its conclusion, and asks if they agree with the result. Oscar congratulates his friend for a job well done. Grank wonders if he said he trained him for a day, then suddenly looks down, admitting his defeat. As Frank shakes the knight's hand, Hamel says they had a hard time getting there, and it's a shame to leave so soon. But Frank asks him to take care of his younger brother, saying that Frank had grown a bit, but tells him to forget it. As he turns away, the young man remains silent while Oscar looks at him, thinking he was a funny guy because Frank was happy, pretending not to have heard. The next day the young man asks if that was the entrance, and why his training room looked like that, if it was obviously a prison in the basement, and Oscar says it had been used for hundreds of years. But he wasn't wrong. Frank asks why he should train in isolation, and Oscar says the vice master personally ordered it, because he has high expectations for him. A young man complains about having to train in isolation after resting for only 1 day, and Oscar tells him he should think positively, since he only needs to help the spirit. Frank complains that it's true, but his friend tells him not to act like a baby, since he wouldn't lose his life. He questions if it's really like that, and then they say their goodbyes. Oscar mentally apologizes to him because, to be honest, he was the one who had asked for this kind of thing. That night after the duel, Hamel asks if he really wants to put Frank in 30 days of isolated training, even though he won the duel, and Oscar says he needs it. Vice Leader says they'll be kind to him for a month, but he has good news. The Sirius company said they can now use the distribution network freely, and Oscar asks if they'll provide it for free, thinking he must have calculated that quickly, just as expected of the company, and they'd profit greatly if the tower revived. And Frank became a great mage, so he thinks he shouldn't feel bad about it, saying that it really was good news. And Hamel says there's a second matter he wants to ask him. He wants to know if he'd like to give a lecture. Oscar says it's not that he couldn't, but thinking that Hamel wanted him to focus on the potion department. For now he asks if there was any reason the White Tower needed to grow strong. In a short time Hamel jokes that he caught on quickly and asks if he heard about the Night of the Mages, the day when mages from all towers gather, originally created to show their skills in harmony. The Emperor made that day to build bonds, but it was obvious that wouldn't happen, since they only fight during the gathering time. Thinking that it was cancelled after a few years, and wondering why Hamel is bringing it up now, and if His Majesty wants to revive the Night of the Mages. Hamel says he's right, and although it hasn't been announced yet, they'll make it public during the new year. And he feels something ominous coming from the Black Tower, because if they keep aiming to be one of the 4 major towers, there's a high chance the White Tower will be attacked, and he's uneasy. Oscar says he'll do it, and Hamel asks about the change in his expression. At the Magic Tower's campus on the 36th floor, Oscar thinks the White Tower is trying to improve, and they're very arrogant. But at least it's a relief that Frank is level 4. The ceremony for a low-level spirit was a stroke of genius, and he's very grateful, thinking that a demigod might remember a mere human. On another day during a spirit summoning, the spirit asks who is summoning one of them to make a contract for others, and Oscar tells it to calm down, calling for Salafrian of the Silence, asking him to let them know that the White Mage had returned. The spirit says he is bold for saying the name of the Spirit King, but butterflies begin to form in the area. The spirit asks who he is, since he invoked the King of Spirits with a single command. Oscar says that if he told, it wouldn't be fun, and asks if he can do this. And the spirit says the Queen allowed a simple transplant without a contract. The mage says that was enough thanks to her, but the spirit warns that she told him to remind Oscar to keep his old promise. The young man thinks she doesn't have to worry, because he would keep it and save many families of the White Tower thanks to it, but he would repay it with interest, with a paper on his lecture about reinterpretation of basic magic. But before that he needs to take care of his family. A man in a suit walks, saying he recognized many faces and thought they were all dead since the last time he saw them, asking if the lecture was for level 3s, since he didn't see anyone above that. And his colleague asks if it's because it's a basic lesson, and the higher mages are busy. A girl says it must be true that the White Tower has more money, and she heard the lecturer was invited by the Vice Master himself. That place was also under imperial observation, and her colleague says the lecturer must be important and she can't wait. But one person tells them not to make him laugh, since doing this in a lecture hall, no one uses. The speaker was Damien Proud, the only son of the Proud Nation. The girl comments that Damien is being too negative, but the young man says it's an investment, and preparing a lecture like the other magic towers wouldn't be about basic magic reinterpretation, asking if he can't just look around at the 32 people there, since only one of the lower-ranked ones didn't come, and it would be a great lesson, as he said. So he was sure that the noble level 2 genius would also come. But something interrupts the conversation, silencing the room. The blonde-haired boy thinks he can't hear anything, and it was all this silence. Oscar walks into the room saying it was good to meet them, because from now on he is the lecturer, who will teach about reinterpretation of basic magic. Oscar crushing the students think the lecturer is a level 2, and Oscar says many are disappointed by the fact that he's the one presenting, thinking that he's aware. And it makes no sense for a low-level mage to be a lecturer, and he must feel guilty since he doesn't use magic. Oscar says if any of them have regrets, they can leave now, because they are no longer academy students under teacher control. But he has one condition. They must prove their ability, showing they don't need to learn this, and the time limit is 10 minutes, and within that time, they must say they won't attend his class. asking if it wasn't a truly simple test. The students complained because he made them unable to speak, and was now telling them to do this. And it was a test because he was level 2. So it definitely wasn't silence. But it was also possible to solve it. In other words, he was saying that if they can't undo the spell and speak, they should take the class. Oscar thinks about their abilities, since he intentionally left a few holes in the spell. But that didn't mean it was easy. When the hard glass was about to run out, he asks if there really won't be anyone. Damien slams the table saying he managed to do it. Oscar thinks that boy was among the beginner mages. Being Damien proud, Oscar congratulates him and the boy replies, it was easier than he expected because he tried to solve it. Slowly the time ends and the spell is undone. While Oscar tells everyone to stay quiet because time is up, and only Damien passed. Damien says it's clear and he doesn't need to take the class, and so the teacher agrees. The prince thinks he let him go so easily, and was honestly curious about what he would learn in this class. Oscar thinks he was still a child and he could see everything. He was thinking, so he says he'll get a reward for being the only one learning a spell, asking which basic spell he liked most. And Damien says it's the wind slash, so the teacher tells him to try it. The student grumbles that it's a bother as he casts his magic, asking if that was enough. Oscar says it was good and he would teach him the wind slash today. Damien asks if he didn't see that floating in front of him. The teacher says that by his standards, it was a half-finished copy and there were 2 problems. Taking a knife in his hand, he says that this spell wasn't made of wind, and asks what Damien thinks wind is. The child replies that wind is moving air. The teacher says water is still water even if gathered, and fire is still fire no matter what. But wind, it is air in constant motion. And that's why he didn't make a proper wind slash. Just like water will rot, magic made of air won't float if it loses form. So they must stay alert, since the White Tower is a place that deals with wind. And in other words, the magic must stay in constant flow. If not, just like he showed earlier, it will be easily destroyed. Damien asks what the other problem was, and Oscar says he lost too much magic when casting that spell, and it'll help a lot if he lowers the amount used if his magic reaches a certain level. He can learn a lot just by watching his opponent cast magic, like their personality, asking if that sounds intrusive, also seeing a bit of their past. And since he's from the proud family, naturally he tried to follow them, copying the wind slash, but before he properly learned magic, it was hard to copy the wind slash, since it was one of the hardest basic spells, and he forced more mana than needed. And that was a habit that continued to this day. Oscar says that since he found the cause, he'll have a perfect wind slash if he fixes the problems. But he lost a student from his class and that's a waste. Damien keeps walking and asks who said he was leaving. As he walks back to his original seat in the class 3 weeks later, the students talk about the rumors of Oscar crushing, saying he was a complete star. Instructor. Classmate asks if that would help someone at the intermediate level, but the boy says that some level 4 and 5 were attending. The student asks if they should go too, and the blue-haired one says honestly, he was waiting for him to say that, and they should leave soon because there were still 7 of them in. Classes started at 9 and they should be there early, since if they're late they might not get in. All the students in the cafeteria remain seated, then suddenly stand up ready to go. People from the class wonder why there were so many level 4 and 5 mages. In a basic magic lesson, even Elder Maxon was there, but at that level was more like an academic magic seminar. Oscar enters the room and greets everyone with a good morning, saying the spell they would learn today was important, so it was good that they came. The students cheer excitedly, and the teacher says, the spell is essential for as long as they live as mages. It was the basic wind spell. The students think it's the most basic of all, the one they learn as soon as they enter the White Tower. Maxim says he's only there to observe, but he's curious and has to ask if Oscar is really going to teach wind to all these people. The teacher confirms and asks if the elder could demonstrate the spell. Maxim uses the wind spell, repelling all the students. He asks if that was enough, and Oscar thanks him. Then ask the student Annie Raven to do the same spell. The girl asks why, since there are people better than her, but she still casts the wind spell. The students say it felt completely soft and warm. Oscar asks if anyone can tell the difference between the spells. The students guess about strength and range, but a student in the back speaks up about the mana temperament. Oscar says Veronica Fricks is correct, saying that just like she said, there's a difference in the temperament of the mana they created. And it's fascinating because in the whole process, from formation to casting, it was the same. One of them was hot like desert wind, and the other soft like a spring breeze. The difference was so big, it was hard to consider it the same wind. And he wanted to ask another question, asking who understands what mana temperament is. One of the students talks about the 4 types of mana, but the teacher says it's a different concept. They differ in how they understand mana, and they must learn the roots of the white tower, in other words balance. And he asks why white and blue are its representatives. One student guesses it's due to the characteristics of the elements, and Oscar confirms that the red and gold towers are strong and fast, but lack harmony since only wind and water can be either hot or cold, symbolizing balance. And the clear distinction of the white and blue towers lies in how they represent balance. For example, the conditions for boiling water are simple. Standard atmospheric pressure needs 100 degrees and some time. And it's simpler because making hot wind is easier than boiling water. Assimilating that is even easier. Changing nature like a chameleon. Making the room cold wind is freer than any other element. It can create a strong force like the flames of the red tower, be fast like the lightning of the gold tower, or have a free form like the water of the blue tower. In addition, the blue tower can't mix water with oil, but wind has no limit and depending on the mage's imagination, can have any temperament. Only wind can harmonize with anything in this world, and as a result, White Tower mages must be aware of how they think and perceive wind, asking what kind of entity they think wind is. That was the point of today's lesson. A colleague beside the elder calls to him, while Maxim whispers about the wind. Oscar tells him to wait before doing anything, while the elder continues calling the wind to him, and the teacher objects. Maxim says he's certain and it definitely is, while Oscar says he mustn't touch it, because everyone should step away from him, so as not to interrupt the elder's enlightenment. And the students ask why all of a sudden. Oscar explains that Maxim is undergoing an awakening, and so the elder opens his eyes. The young man asks if he's okay, and Maxim says he still hasn't reached level 8, thanking Oscar for that, but says that since he's a teacher there, I should be the one thanking him. The young man says that's nice to hear, thinking that thanks to him, his lessons will be easier in the future, and no one below him will try to attack him. Thinking the best part of it all was about Veronica Frick, in the middle of the crowd, since he managed to get the attention of one of the problem children he read about in Oscar's journal. The next day the boy walks through the tower, thinking that Veronica said there was something interesting in the training room, and the reason she acted friendly was because she liked the lesson, and he knows she was looking at him pitifully for not knowing. The gym room, he arrives in front of a place and wonders if that's since he heard that 3 of the 13 training rooms were like this, but the color of the doors was different, questioning if it's special, because they wouldn't be doing this if it weren't a magic door that opens only when touched. Oscar looks up, talking about the different sensations, and a voice message greets him, introducing itself as Argo, the next generation training system. And Oscar thinks that the training room uses magical engineering, and those bastards from the Golden Tower must have taken all the money. Well, Argo says he'll get specific training if he registers his info, but the boy refuses. He's going to train as someone without records, and must decide the training level, since there are 100 levels in the program, and he can train to his own standards. Oscar tells it to start from level 1, and the system understands, making 3 balls appear, instructing the mage to use physical attacks or magic to burst the 3, and if he uses a horizontal area spell, it will be cancelled. But the boy bursts them easily and thus passes level 1. Oscar thinks it wasn't bad and wants to raise the level. Argo asks which level he'll choose. The mage selects level 100, and the system warns that the size of the balls will shrink and speed up a lot, now being hostile, and if he's at risk, he should cancel. Oscar wonders how amazing it must be to cause this kind of chaos, but a very fast light passes behind him. Argo tells him to use a physical attack or magic to burst the 1,000 balls, and if he uses an area spell, it will be cancelled, and if more than 10 attacks hit, it will be the same. Oscar launches 3 wind slashes, cutting the balls in a line, thinking he needs to burst the balls, and at this rate his mana will run out, so he'll do his best to use some power as soon as possible. Creating more wind daggers would start to burst the balls afterward. Oscar thinks it was effective to make them bigger and sharper, but doing that he would surpass the training level for children. Argo congratulates him for passing level 100. Oscar says it was a good warm-up while lying on the floor, and the mages of this generation must train like this from a young age, and the standard for mages of this generation must be higher than before. So he needs to work harder and eat to build more muscle. Veronica enters the room and says she didn't think he'd come, and Oscar says she's there early to train, calling for Veronica, while the girl replies that she thought he ignored what she said. Oscar says he just came to visit, and that his philosophy is that healthy mana creates a healthy body. So the girl questions if that isn't Oscar Sage's philosophy, wondering if he ate something bad that morning, and why he was saying Oscar Sage's famous line as if it were his, and why the bastard who looked down on her for being a noble, even though both were orphans, suddenly changed, then tells Argo to prepare a level 50 warm-up. She asks if there was a change in the rankings, and if Killian was still there. Argo says there was a change in reality. The girl tells it to show her, seeing the name AAA and wanting to know who he is, but Argo says that due to personal information security, can't tell her. The girl wonders if he was an elder, but denies it because you need to be below level 5 to have a rank, but he managed to beat the 10-minute demon's record. Argo says he was the first, but the girl asks who he was. However, for personal security, the system couldn't say, wanting to know if it was Oscar crushing, but Argo repeats the answer. The boy walks through the corridors wondering if he'll be sore soon, but he meets Elder Maxim on the way. Oscar greets him and the elder says it's perfect timing, because he has something to ask him, since Fidelina said the merchants aren't buying their potions, and it must be the Azure Tower's doing. But as a member of the production team, he should know about it. Oscar walks away irritated, thinking about those pathetic bastards, and wonders why the coffee line was so long that day. A student comments that it was an email from the 1st to the 5th post, wondering if he heard since starting today, they were going to increase his salary. Oscar asks himself if they were delivery workers, and his colleague comments that they finally got a break. The major reflects that deliveries definitely aren't a big market, because they must use many workers without making much money, or gaining more power, and the only benefit was receiving ratings from the citizens. The red-haired delivery man says the elders were giving them food because they were working hard with, which catches Oscar's attention. He politely asked the myth. While making deliveries they often bump into people. The delivery workers affirm it, since they need signatures on the container to prove they properly delivered the items. Mage says that was a big help and thanks them. Running off, Hamill summarizes his student's information, asking if he wants to deliver door to door with people, and the mage agrees. The old man says that since the merchants weren't operating, they should target the consumers, and their potions aren't used every day. But Oscar says he's making a new one. Hamill repeats the word innovation, and the young man says he couldn't call it that, since it's a mid-level recovery potion that's highly effective in the White Tower, and they can gradually adjust this potion to be divided into 4, based on age and gender. Oscar begins to daydream about the properties of each of the 4 potions, to better connect with the citizens. A few days later, an old man sitting in the square says he's gotten older and doesn't have much energy anymore. A delivery man approaches and says it's good to see him after yesterday, since he has a letter for today. And the old man smiles, saying his friends were still alive. The delivery man then says the people were from the Centennial generation. The old man repeats that since he's only 80, and he feels his head getting heavier, because he doesn't have much energy. So the delivery man asks why the old man doesn't try this, handing him a potion and saying it's the latest creation from his magic tower. A tonic called S0. Our video ends here. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, bye bye.